All right, heroes, welcome to the Jew Curious Show. This is a live studio recording of our Jew Curious Show podcast. Just going to check all the feeds, check all the pipes, make sure folks are here. If you are here for the live studio recording, please give me a shout out. Say who you are, say where you're from, and I'd love to call you out to other people who are watching this. And really excited about this live format. Sorry, I've got a bit of a Tom Waits voice this morning. Not knocking Tom Waits. I'm a huge fan of this musician called Tom Waits. But for some reason this morning, I can only sing Alice. And I'd sing Alice, but it might engender some kind of copyright violations here on YouTube. And so a secret kiss brings madness. Okay, that's about enough of that. So really delighted to be on live with you today and want to see what questions you have on the chat. We've got Vanessa's here from Germany. We've got Alexandria, Virginia from New York. Alexandria, Virginia is her name, but she's coming in from New York. We've got our friend Jessica from Boca Raton, Florida. Really delighted to see you all here. And this episode, we're doing something not entirely different. We've done a little bit of this before, but I want to make it more intentional. This is an experiment whereby we are recording the Jew Curious Show podcast. That's an audio-only format, live in a studio situation. The inspiration for this was I've been to a couple of tapings of radio shows. And one was Prairie Home Companion many years ago, back when I lived in Minneapolis. We, crossed the bridge into St. Paul and listened to the Prairie Home Companion, or rather watched it being recorded live. Recently, and I'm going to out myself as a total NPR nerd, that's totally okay with me. And if you are as well, high five, enjoy your tote bag. But recently, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to a taping of the show Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is an NPR news quiz show with some comedians and things like that. And we got to see the show being recorded live. And then a little while later, we got to listen to that show via podcast. It's it's on NPR every week, but it's often more convenient just to listen to it by podcast whenever we happen to be driving. And so my wife and I got to see that, and it was awesome. First off, it was a big live show. It was at the Greek Theater here in Los Angeles. The special guest was Jon Hamm, and that wasn't on our ticket or anything. It just said with special guest, and then we're all in suspense as to see who's going to be the special guest. And Jon Hamm walks out. This is Jon Hamm from what is that show? Mad Men. He's on that show. He's been on several shows. He's been on 30 Rock and other things. He is, I'll say, just as handsome in person. And Peter Sagal, the host of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, took great pains to point that out. And charming as well. And just a really genuinely nice guy. What was interesting for me as somebody who produces a podcast and sometimes records them and makes mistakes and does retakes and then edits out the mistakes so that you can't hear it, was that they were doing that live, where the host or other people would say something and then, blip, burp, something happens, and then they would say the thing over again. And I just sat back and said, this is just like recording a podcast where I'll say something and have to edit it out. However, it could be a really good live experience. We had a blast watching this show in a live theater setting and then hearing it again, the edited format later. So that's kind of my goal here with this YouTube format that we're doing right now, is to do a live studio recording. So this stuff that I'm talking about right now, this is just for you and me, just for us live, or if you're watching the replay. But this is going to go into a Jew Curious Show podcast episode, God willing, very soon, because today we are talking about the Parashat Hashavua, the Torah portion of the week, which is Parashat Pekudei. And once Shabbos hits, it sort of goes past this expiration date, and we'll be talking about the book of Leviticus next week. So in just a minute, we're going to get into it. I'm going to say things like you might hear me say on the podcast. We'll say we're going to be talking about this thing right after this bass. And I don't have the music queued up, so there'll be nothing. Maybe I'll just make a bass sound with my voice. And then we'll just proceed as if it's a regular Jew Curious Show podcast episode. However, a big difference between this and my normal episodes is that we'll be doing a live Q&A. And I see that Teresa is here from Cyprus. William gives me a Shabbat Shalom from let's see, what is it? Wakiva Springs, Florida. I've got Aaron Beatty from Merritt Island, Florida. I recognize you, Aaron. Good to see you here. So we've got a lot of Floridians, and we're doing well in Florida, it seems like. So a lot of Jew-curious people in Florida. So in just a second, we're going to start with this recording. It might seem a little stilted because I'm going to do my intro voice and my outro voice. And then what I'm going to do is share a couple of reflections that I have on this week's Torah portion, which I'm excited to share with you. This is the last parsha of the Sefer Shemot, or the book of Exodus. And then we really change gears when we go into Leviticus. So let's see what we have to learn about this. And God willing, this will go well. And I trust that people will hang in there, ask me some great questions. We got a Shabbat Shalom from Autumn. We got E.M. Burgers typing in from Toronto. Thank you. I'm so glad to have you here, E.M. Burgers. So let's get into this. And the Jew Curious show usually starts a little something like this. Hero, have you ever made a mistake that you thought was totally unforgivable? You didn't know whether the people who were affected by that would forgive you, or whether God would forgive you? In this episode, we are going to talk about Parashat Pekudei, the final Torah portion of Sefer Shemot, or the book of Exodus, and we'll talk about forgiveness, and we'll also talk about God's trust in human ingenuity right after this bass. And this is the part where we usually have Joey Weissenberg, a fantastic musician, his Hadar ensemble, play possibly my favorite song of theirs, which is Nola Niggin. I think this is on their last album. You can find that on YouTube as well. When I linked it up in the show notes, you can find that episode on YouTube. Fantastic three-part wordless melody that I use for the intro music for the Jew Curious show, with Joey's permission, of course. We got Milo here from Denmark today. Psyched to see you, Milo. So let's jump back into this episode. This is the part where I usually say, thank you, Ron Snow, our voice-over master. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble, for those beautiful, inspiring introductory beats. You will hear the end of that song at the end of the show. But thank you, most of all, Hero, for watching this video. Thank you, most of all, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show podcast. And today I get to say something else. Thank you for watching the Jew Curious Show podcast. This has been mostly an audio show up until now, but lately I've been experimenting with doing live studio recordings. So that's what you're hearing right now. I'm in my little studio setup here. I've got my microphone on, but I've also got my camera on, live streaming to YouTube. And I do that so that I can teach in a more interactive way. I don't want to just be preaching at y'all, although preaching is something I love to do quite a bit. But what I love even more is when there are people present live and people can ask their questions about what I'm talking about, or any Jewish topic whatsoever. I'll say, just for today's show, let's keep it Jewish, right? If you have a question about, is milk bad for you, or are eggs now good for you again? That's something for a nutritionist. I'm a rabbi, barely an expert in Jewish stuff, not an expert in nutrition. So let's keep the questions Jewish today. But in just a minute, I'm going to start teaching the Parashat Hashavua, the Torah portion of the week, and this week's Torah portion is Pekudei. This is the last Torah portion of Sefer Shemot, of the book of Exodus, and it's neat this year because most years we have two parshiot, two Torah portions kind of shmushed together, and that's Vayakel and Pekudei. And in other parts of the Jewish year, we have other Torah portions shmushed together. This has to do with our lunisolar calendar, the Hebrew calendar, which some weeks has 50 years and some weeks has 54 or 55 years. But every year we have 54 Torah portions. So if we have a 50-week year, there's times when we have to put a couple of the Torah portions together just to make sure they get read. But in a leap year like this one, where we have 13 months, we have 2 Adars. Very wise of the rabbis. They said, okay, leap years, we're going to have 2 months. And somebody said, which month? And they said, how about the most fun one, right? Let's do Adar. Let's do the month of joy. Let's do the month that we have the holiday of Purim in. P.S. Purim is coming. So this year we get to read Vayakel and Pekudei separately and really dig deep into those things without having to decide which one are we going to learn from, which one am I going to teach from. And so today we're going to talk about a couple of very important points from Parashat Pekudei. And I say you should pick one point, but there's just two that I can't gloss over, that I love both of them. So I'm going to share both of them with you. It's like kind of like a double stuffed Oreo of Torah portions. Before we get into that, let's see who is here and has joined us. We have Vanessa from Germany, Alexandria from New York, Jessica from Florida is here with us live, Teresa from Cyprus, William from Waukee Springs, Florida. I've never heard of Waukee Springs, but I imagine it's delightful. We've got Aaron from Merritt Island, Florida. Got a lot of Floridians here. We've got Ian Burgers from Toronto, Milo from Denmark, Grycicle from Palm Desert. That's right here in California. Put a little picture of a camel there in the chat and a cactus. I've been to Palm Desert. I'm not trying to brag. I've driven through Palm Desert. I'll put it that way. We've got Elizabeth here. We've got, let's see, Milo. Grycicle had, eggs had better be better because I'm eating them right now. And Dr. Berg here said so. So we're making a little joke about eggs, and we are jumping into the jokes live here. Autumn is here from Arizona. Elizabeth is from Maryland. We are interstate as a podcast, and we are international. We've got Canada. We've got Denmark. We've got people joining us from Cyprus, which is a country in the Mediterranean Sea, very close to Eretz Yisrael. So before we get started, I just want to take a pause for the sake of people for whom this is your first time learning with me. If it's your first time watching one of my YouTube videos, you should know that I've got about 170 YouTube videos on various Jewish topics. We've done a lot of long-form live videos lately with Q&As, but I also have videos as short as 90 seconds. If you want to learn all about the Hebrew Bible in 90 seconds. That's one of my most popular videos. We've got things about Jewish weddings and Jewish funerals and everything in between, and what we do for children when they're born. We've got Jewish words explained. I'll say Sunday and Monday, I get a spike of views from my video, what does Shavua Tov mean? Which is a special greeting we have after Shabbat. It means, hey, Happy New Week, basically. So I've got a lot of videos on this channel, and if you want to learn more from me, if you like the cut of my jib, the best thing to do is to subscribe to this channel. There's a little button on your screen. It says subscribe. You hit that button, and then you are automatically notified every time I make a new video. Every time I schedule a new live video like this one, YouTube, the nice people at YouTube, will let you know. And once you're subscribed to this channel, you don't have to worry about finding videos that I'm doing. You'll just have those right at your fingertips and eyeball tips, I guess. I don't know if that's a word. But once you subscribe to this subscribe to this channel, sit back and enjoy the learning that we have to do together, and I'm delighted to learn this stuff with you. If you are listening to this podcast for the first time, know that we've got about 30 episodes so far. This is actually episode number 28, I believe, and then there's an episode 0, so technically it's 29. But we've done a lot of great learning together. We've had interviews with fantastic guests, rabbis, musicians, other kinds of artists, challah aficionados. We've got a rabbi who's a Twitter maven coming up pretty soon. He teaches great Torah on Twitter, Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. That's going to be our next episode, so stay tuned for that one. It was a fantastic conversation. I think that's probably going to drop like next Monday, I guess. But we have lots of great interviews. We have a few shows where it's just me and the people joining me live to learn a little bit of Torah together. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is make these podcasts, because I've really been able to connect with some very cool Jew-curious people. You do not have to be Jewish to listen to this. You do not have to be Jewish to learn about Torah. That's why I call it the Jew-Curious Show. This can be for people who are just curious about Judaism, whether you are Jewish or whether you're on the path to becoming Jewish, or whether you're not remotely interested in being Jewish, but you're exploring the Jewish roots of your own faith, or you are a spiritual seeker trying on different spiritual paths. This show is for you, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join me. And so what I'll suggest is that if you are just joining us for the first time, you might want to consider subscribing to this podcast. Most podcast listening formats have a way to click a button or tap a little picture of a button on your screen, And that way you will automatically be able to download all future episodes of this show, as well as our archive of past episodes. And as soon as we come out with a new one, it will be automatically downloaded to your favorite podcast listening device, as well as your least favorite. But let's focus on your favorite. So consider subscribing to this show so we can continue learning together like we're about to do right now. I'm just going to jump into the chat, see who else has joined us. Let's see. Grycicle says, by the way, Rev Carrier is a guest sometimes on the Tanakh Talk channel here. That's so great. Also says, hey, I was in Palm Springs yesterday and it was awesome with Dr. Letts and Eisenhower Health, and he's a doll, really. So I'm going to take your word for that. I've never met Dr. Letts. We've got Caleb from Tejas. Oh man, one of my landsmen, one of my countrymen. I am. If you haven't met me before, or haven't heard me talk for more than 10 minutes, then you may not know that I am a proud son of the Republic of Texas, the only state in the Union that was its own country for 10 years. I actually just got back from there, was in town last weekend for my sister's wedding in Dallas. And so I might have a few more y'alls this episode. I find that when I spend time with my family, my accent of birth emerges. So please forgive me if the drawl takes over. Sometimes when I get excited about stuff, and I'm really excited about today's Torah portion, I might say some y'alls and other Texas-y things like boy howdy, for example. Let's see. We have hi girls, Higa girls, Steph. First time listening, really love it already. I'm so excited to have you here. So Caleb's laughing at me. I believe Caleb was on a live session. I called out Big Red Soda, and Caleb knew exactly what I was talking about. If you're familiar with Texas, you're familiar with Big Red and Whataburger, which unfortunately I'm not eating as many Whataburgers these days due to, let's say, the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It's not really on my menu. However, I am a big fan of the Whataburger franchise. If you are a cheeseburger eating person, you do you. I don't yuck your yums. I've taken a different spiritual path for my own reasons, but I'm a big fan of the Whataburger franchise. So I get no money from the Whataburger people, by the way. I'm just waxing nostalgic here. So enough about me. I really want to share with you some insights that I gleaned from this week's Torah portion, Parashat Pekudei, and I've got a couple of different things I want to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is human ingenuity, human creativity, our capacity to create. We learn from the book of Genesis, from Sefer Breshit, that we are created in God's image. And what's the first thing that we see God do before humans even come into the scene? God creates, right? It says right there in the beginning, literally the words "in the beginning" or Bereshit. Little bit of a controversy there over vowels and things like that. Bereshit is in the beginning, but the word is actually Bereshit, which means in beginning, in the process of beginning, at this beginning point of the creation of this iteration of the universe. And might blow your mind there cosmologically. Maybe there were other universes before this one. But in beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. First verb used about God is creation or creating. And incidentally, Breshit bara, so that bara is a special verb in Hebrew for which the only suitable subject is God. If a human being creates something, we say oseh or something like that. There's a different verbs for humans creating things than when God creates stuff. So godding God's self, or acting creative by nature is bara. But that's the first thing we learn about God, is that God is creative. And then when God makes people, God says, let us create humans in our image. There's a little controversy there as well with that phrase our, right? Because why our? Are there a bunch of gods there? Chas v'shalom, there should be a bunch of gods there. The rabbis say this is basically God talking to the heavenly host, the angels, as it were, the court, the retinue, the posse, and say, to other slightly inferior divine beings, or vastly superior divine beings, or vastly or vastly inferior divine beings, but people who are hanging around before people. And God says, let us create humans in our image. So this gives us the idea, I think the Latinate scholars say imitatio Dei, or the imitation of God, in that we are stewards of the earth, and also, I'll say, partners in the ongoing co-creation of the universe. We have creative capacity. We have ingenuity. We have free will to use that or not. And those are a lot of big ideas. You might wonder why this is related to this week's Parsha. But what happens in this Parsha is we talk about Betzalel. Betzalel is, I'm going to say, the chief architect of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, of this portable sanctuary that we are instructed to build. And so God says, okay, Moses, we're going to, get Betzalel and his assistant Aholiab, and they are going to oversee the creation of this. They're going to oversee the creation of this Mishkan. And I mean oversee, they don't do all the work themselves. People bring all the raw materials. Various kinds of craftspeople fashion the different smaller parts of the Mishkan. They make tapestries for tent covering. They make animal hide coverings for those tapestries so it's waterproof, because even in the desert, it sometimes rains, folks. And they make beautiful lavers for priests washing their hands before doing sacrifice. They make a lampstand. They make an altar. They make all sorts of different instruments and articles for the holy worship. And Aholiab and Betzalel are overseeing this process. And so God tells Moses that, okay, Aholiab is going to be your guy, but ask the people what they think. And Moses goes out and says, hey, who's the best guy for this job? Moses is more like the general contractor, if you will, or the CEO of the development corporation. I mean, he's in charge of making sure that it happens, but not the particulars of the construction necessarily. And the people say, okay, if we're going to have one guy in charge to make sure that this is beautiful and useful and appropriate for its service, Betzalel is our guy, and Aholiab is the best guy to help him out. So Betzalel is chosen not only by God for this, but also by the people. God really wanted to trust our judgment and ingenuity. Kind of knew what the outcome was going to be, but wanted to put the ownership of that decision in our hands. This is one example of God trusting in human ingenuity. But it gets better, or at least it gets even more detailed as I see it. So when we're talking about building this Mishkan, this portable sanctuary, if you're just catching up, I'll give you a little bit of backstory. First, we get liberated from Egypt. That's going pretty far back, but we're still in the book of Exodus. We are guided through the wilderness, and then we are given the 10 Commandments, sort of the first 10 instructions for God's guide to life for a free people, which is how I describe the Torah. People may disagree about this, but this is how I see the Torah. The Torah is a guide to life for a free. The Torah is a guide to life for a free people. We leave slavery. We can do anything we like, but now we want to know, or need to know, what should we do? And so God reveals this to us, starting with the 10 Commandments, and then says, okay, you're going to need a sanctuary. You are going to need a place to build and carry along with you in the wilderness so that God can dwell among you from time to time. Right? God's going to pay a visit. and we're going to need God to pay a visit. And I'll tell you why in just a second if you haven't heard this story before. But God gives us detailed instructions. Tell the people to bring whatever their heart instructs them to. Be specific. God's going to need gold and silver and jewels and tapestries and structural wood, rods of acacia wood and things like that. And I don't know if you know this about acacia. Acacia does not lend itself to rods. Acacia is a desert tree that's kind of gnarly, not in the Fast Times at Ridgemont High sense, but it's gnarled. It goes off in a lot of different directions because it's a wilderness plant in a windswept landscape, and so it grows in gnarls. So if you can find a pole, like a long straight board of acacia, that's a pretty precious thing. So this is nice stuff we're talking about. But God says, here are the things that I need. I'm not going to tell anybody how much to bring. I'm just going to tell everybody to bring what their heart inspires them to bring. And then gives us this instruction on what to do with this stuff. And so we get a long list of instructions on how to build the thing. We're not building the thing yet, but it's like, we've just picked it up from IKEA. We've got all the parts in front of us. We've got the little booklet with the stick figures or the cartoon people putting together the furniture, but we haven't built it yet. And then there's a bit of an interlude where Moses and God are sequestered for a little while God delivers the rest of this guide to life, the Torah, for us. And the people get frustrated and they get scared and they say, okay, we haven't seen Moses or God for 40 days or 40 nights. Maybe we need a new leader. Maybe we need a new God. We don't know if God's going to come back. So they make a golden calf. And that ends poorly. Let's say God said, okay, like one of the very first things I told you to do was to not make an idol. And you made an idol. And it came very close to wiping us out for this. But, we were spared. And once the golden calf episode is over, then we get into the construction of this thing that we were instructed to build. So we have some forethought, some foreknowledge that we're going to need a portable sanctuary. God knows that we're going to be up to no good if we're kind of left alone. And so we need a place for God to dwell among us. And then we prove why with the whole golden cow episode. And once that's over, once we've learned our lesson, God willing, although we're still, idolizing things maybe we shouldn't, and that's a human quality, then we get down to the nitty gritty of building this thing where God can descend and be among us. And so that's just a little backstory for people who are just joining us for the first time, haven't heard the whole story before, because I believe all of it's important, all of it's integrated. Thank you for bearing with me. And what's interesting is that when God says to build this stuff, to build a tent, effectively, and to create the things that go inside the tent, God says, I believe in Exodus 31, you should make a tent, and you should make an ark, that is a little box to hold the tablets of the commandments, and you should make various vessels and accoutrements. You should make an altar and a washing station, and you should make a lamp, and we'll just sort of call this the furniture of this portable house. And then Moses turns around to Bezalel and Aholiab and says, okay, I've just got the instructions from God. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to make these vessels, and you're going to make an ark, and you are going to make a tent. And it sounds the same, but the order is important. According to the rabbis of our tradition, there are no wasted words in the Torah. There are no accidents in this revelation that we've gotten. And so everything is worthy of learning something from. God says tent, ark, and then furniture. Moses says furniture, ark, and tent. What's going on here? Before we get to that, Bezalel, there's a midrash about Bezalel, because what then happens in this parsha is that Bezalel flips the order that Moses said. Moses says furniture, ark, tent. Bezalel, in this order, makes the tent, the ark, and the furniture. Exactly like God said, but didn't say to Bezalel. And so there's a midrash about this. A midrash is a body of rabbinic literature that, it's not the exact same as the Torah, but it'll take a section of the Torah that might seem confusing or not obvious, and then expands on it. And so in this sense, the Midrash says that, this is actually a Midrash that appears in the Talmud, a different body of literature, but similar purpose. In the Talmud, it says that Bezalel went to Moses and said, Moses, you said build the furniture and the ark and then the tents, but I am an expert craftsperson. I'm not trying to brag, but people have said so. And who builds furniture before building their house? right? You have to build a house first, and then you put the furniture inside, because otherwise that furniture is just sitting out in the rain, and nobody's going to do that. Right. So the first thing, and I don't know if anybody here are fans of Frank Lloyd Wright, for example. Frank Lloyd Wright would design a house and design all the furniture that went in that house as well. This was kind of Bezalel's gig, sort of maybe the Frank Lloyd Wright of his day. And he said the only logical thing to do here, I know what you told me to do, but the only logical thing to do here is to build the tent and the ark and then the furniture. And so that's what he did. And when he said this to Moses, Moses says, you know what? That's pretty wise. It's actually what God said to me. And it seems to me that when God was speaking to me, you must have been in God's shadow and overheard this. And how Moses said God's shadow, according to the Talmud, is Betzel El, which means, but Tzel is shadow, Betzel is in the shadow, Betzel El is the shadow of God. And so his name, Betzalel, Moses does a little pun on this. I'm not a big punster myself, but it's a very popular hermeneutic device in rabbinic literature. Moses says, hey, Betzalel, you must have been Betzelel, because even without me giving you explicit instructions, you were able to derive godlike wisdom based on your human ingenuity, your mastery of craft. And so from this, we learn that God gives these overarching instructions, and God is logical in how God does this. God says you need a tent before you need a house before you can have furniture. And Moses reorders it according to his principles, meaning perhaps the most critical thing is not the tent, but what happens inside the tent. Right? This tent isn't for tent's sake. This tent is for the sake of serving God, and those are the furnishings, the vessels. It's also for preserving this covenant, and the least important thing is the tent that keeps all this stuff out of the rain. Right? And so Moses had an interpretation to share, and it's okay to have an interpretation. Right? There's some views of the Bible that, in a very bumper sticker way, as Rabbi Brad Artson shared, as Rabbi Brad Hirschfield shared on the podcast. Some people have this bumper sticker that says, "God said it, I do it. The Torah says it, that's what we do." Very simple. But Moses, in that moment, takes God's instruction, and through his particular ingenuity of teaching, that's why we call him Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, says, let's order this in priority of service, preservation of the revelation, and then the practical stuff. And then Bezalel, in his ingenuity, reorders it and says, look, as a craftsperson, you need the tent first. That's just how it is for everything to work. And I think this is a demonstration of God trusting in humans to get the right things done. Do we make mistakes? All the time. That's why we have tshuva. That's why we have repentance. That's why no human being is perfect, but all human beings are perfectible. We have a way for recovering from mistakes. And that's necessary because we are trusted to make mistakes. And that's the second thing that I want to teach about this Parsha, and why I share that whole long story about a golden cow. See, this was about the most drastic mistake that we could make. Right there in the top 10, right up near the top, don't make idols. And there are those who teach that we are still making up for that chet ha'egel, that sin of the golden calf. In another lesson that I did, somebody brought up, it's like, hey, I heard a rabbi say that, we're suffering today because God hasn't fully forgiven us for that whole golden calf thing. And there are lots of rabbis in the world. There are many with whom I disagree, probably a lot more who disagree with me. But I'm going to call bogus on that. And here's why. In this Parsha, there is sometimes it's called the Mishkan, sometimes it's called the Ohel Moed, which is, the tent of appointment or the tent of assembly, right? Because this is not, not just because you're putting the tent together and you're some assembly required, but because it's where people assemble to worship, And people assemble to, hey, how are you doing? And schmooze. Like, oh, you're in Camp Don and I'm in Camp Ruvain, and we don't get to see each other that much, but here we're in Shul, so let's get together. So that's the tent of assembly. In this Parsha, there's another name used for this structure, and that is the Ohel Edut. Right, the tent. An edut means can mean a couple of things. It can mean testimony, like a witness. An aid is a witness. An edut is what a witness says. It is testimony, right? But it also means covenant. So if you've heard of the Old Testament or the New Testament, that's sort of an English word translation of covenant or pact. And so when the rabbis look at Ohel Edut, it's like, wait, I thought it was the tent of gathering. Now it's the tent of the pact. They ask, what's the pact? Right? Is it just the tent to house the 10 commandments, that covenant? Because there's a lot of other stuff that goes on here too. And one rabbi said, no, here's the pact. The pact is that the Ohel, the tent, the Mishkan, or tabernacle, is our tikkun for the golden calf. Tikkun means a reparation or a mending or a reintegration. If you've ever heard the phrase tikkun olam, or healing the world or mending the world or repairing the world, that's what the Mishkan represents, specifically for the error of the golden calf. And so the rabbi's interpretation on this section, it is called the tent of the pact because it's not only there for worship and for service and for assembly, it's also there to show us that God has forgiven us for that error with the golden calf. Now, there are some faiths that espouse something called original sin, that humans are flawed from birth. We are flawed from birth because of a particular episode in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. God said, don't touch the fruit. We touched the fruit. We not only touched the fruit, we took a bite. Maybe we made an apple crumble out of it. We really went in with the fruit. And this original transgression against God's word has tainted humanity forever. And then humanity needs an external force for redemption throughout all time. Jews see this episode very differently. Instead of an action that acquires a sin that we cannot cleanse ourselves, we see what happens in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, as the gift of free will. God gives us an instruction and lets us follow it or not. And guess what? Not. We didn't follow the instruction. And what we got out of that, this particular fruit, was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. We broke the law. We disobeyed God from the outset, and then ate the fruit and learned that there is a difference between right and wrong. And with that knowledge, ever since then, we haven't been irredeemably sinful. We have been free. We have been free to make that choice between good and evil. What comes with that gift and perhaps curse of responsibility is not only the ability to choose between right and wrong, but the ability for making up for the times when we choose wrong. It was said that even before humans were put into the world, God created tshuva, God created repentance and reparation and returning to the right path, because without it, we couldn't survive. If we didn't have the ability to make mistakes, we would never learn anything, and we wouldn't have any moral responsibility. That's not what God wanted from us. God wanted us to make mistakes to learn from and to take responsibility for our actions. But the safety net, if you will, is this parallel gift of tshuva and the ability to make up for those mistakes that we made that didn't just hurt us, but hurt other people and maybe impaired our relationship with God. That's what Yom Kippur is all about. But trust me, you can do it all year long. Anytime you can make a mistake, and anytime you can try to make up for that mistake, whether with a person or with God or with your own higher sensibilities. And that's the essence of the Mishkan. The worst sin that we could do right out of the gate says no idolatry. Boom, idle. Didn't waste any time. Took us less than 6 weeks to break that rule. But even that is forgivable. Even that is reparable. And that's what the Mishkan is. And the last thing that I want to teach about tshuva is Maimonides teaches a lot about tshuva in the Mishnah Torah, in this particular law code. And he says, okay, here's how you apologize to somebody. Here's how you accept an apology. And at the end of it, he says, okay, how do you know it's working? Right? How do you know that the tshuva is effective? And he says, here's how you know. If you make a mistake and you make an error, if you make an error, you make tshuva. You apologize for that. You make amends with the person who you've harmed. But that's not all. What you do is you then reform yourself. You perhaps rearrange your life in ways that will help you make better decisions in the future. And here's how you know tshuva is working is if you are presented with the same opportunity in the future, the same choice, and instead of doing what you did before, you make a better choice, that's how you know your tshuva has been effective, right? And so it's not just the action of making a mistake, the action of making up for it, and the action of making a different decision. It's that preparation in the meantime, right? How do you order, maybe you have friends who lead you in a path that's not healthy for you. And to get healthy, sometimes you need to sever those relationships or reorganize those relationships and say, like, look, I know we used to go steal cars together. I still like you, but I'm not going to steal cars with you anymore. And we have to establish that. You have to reorder your world in order to make better decisions in the future. And that's what the Mishkan is, right? God says, you know what? I said no idolatry. I know they're going to do it. I just know they're going to do it. So I'm going to tell them about this tent. And then they did it. And then God said, okay, I think it's time to build the tent now. I get it that you made this mistake because I was absent. And so I'm going to show you that I want to be with you. And so we are reordering your world. Before you were just 12 tribes walking in formation across the wilderness. Now you have some extra stuff to carry. You have to carry tent poles, and you have to carry fabric and hides and this big lamp and all sorts of stuff. But I'm giving that to you to know that wherever you are, I can be with you. And so in the future, if I'm busy or something and you don't feel me or you're busy and you don't feel me immediately present, just look at the tent. That's not that the tent is an idol, but the tent is a reminder that I want to be with you. And that will help you make a better decision in the future. So heroes, I want to leave you with this in this particular teaching. Then we'll jump into the Q&A, see what kind of questions people have. But I want you to know that you are not irreparably flawed, right? You are where you need to be right now. Maybe you have mistakes. Maybe you have guilt. Maybe you're struggling with something. But the tools are there, right? It's possible to repair relationships. It's possible to let go of some relationships that leave us on a bad path. None of us is perfect. We are all perfectible. And I'd like to think, and this was actually taught to me by one of my students yesterday, that the Mishkan is there to show us that we can carry God with us wherever we go. We can carry our own highest ideals with us. We may not always adhere to them, but we always have the tools. We can look to the Torah. We can look to our Jewish or Jew-curious community and know that there are people there who support us. So as you face the coming week, take a break, take Shabbos, enjoy yourself. But then you're going to have to be back into it. Know that if you want to make a better decision about your life, the tools, the people, and the guidance is there for you. And you can trust in that. And maybe you're not perfect, but maybe you're a little bit better because of decisions that you make and the tools that you have at your disposal. So with that, I want to dive into the Q&A that we have. We've got a lot of chat. I was just talking there for a while, wasn't I? So I'm going to jump right into this and see what comments have had people along the way. William Morales asks, why is the Mishkan called Mishkan Ha'edut? That was exactly what I was talking about. So that testimony is also a pact, but the rabbis think that some rabbis think that's specifically a pact about, some people got hurt with that whole cow thing, but God said, made a deal with Moses. Okay, Moses, you say don't wipe him out, not going to wipe him out. That's the pact. Right, is that we have the ability to recover from that, and that the Mishkan represents that ability. Let's see what else we have going on here. Why did they choose a calf as opposed to another animal? Is there symbolism here? Why did they put faith in something that they had made as opposed to following some existing idol of the people? And so I'm not sure, personally, I'm sure there's some commentary on this. I'm not sure why they picked a calf per se. I think what's important is that they picked an animal, right? And they were used to this. These are all, if you recall, not so long ago, these were slaves and urban construction workers in Egypt, building temples, building storehouses, observing their Egyptian neighbors, worshiping statues of things that they saw in the natural world. They picked a calf. You could interpret that as we know of our ancestors that they were ranchers, right? They raised cattle. That's why they dwelled in Goshen, which was sort of a suburb, I guess, of Egypt, of that city. And was it Cairo back then, or just called Egypt, or Nile Town? I'm not exactly sure. We just called it Mitzrayim, name of the country. And so when Joseph's brothers came to dwell with him in Egypt, Pharaoh said, "Hey, nice to meet the family. What do you do?" And they say, "We are cattlemen," right? And then begin cattle in sort of a broad sense, sheep, goats, possibly cows. I don't know what animals were available for livestock there and then, but they said we're cattle people, right? And even Joseph said, "Don't tell them that. People like Egyptians don't like cowboys." And this is why maybe I might be very uncomfortable if I went to Egypt, because I'm from Texas, and thick or thin, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, genetically speaking. I won't vouch for any players or owners or anything, but when the Cowboys are on, I have to root for the Cowboys. That's just a family tradition. But the Egyptians weren't into cowboys. They certainly weren't rooting for the Cowboys back then. But they say, Egypt was not a fan of raising livestock. Like, they had agriculture was their thing. Maybe they were vegetarian, but they kind of looked down on people who raised cattle. And so Joseph said, don't tell them exactly what you do. He said, tell them that you're breeders of you're specialists, right? You deal with cattle sometimes. But then the brothers went to Pharaoh and said, "Yep, cowboy here, right? We raise cattle. That's our deal." And he says, "That's very nice. Why don't you settle in Goshen, which is a little bit outside of town, and you do you, and you won't bother us. It's useful to have cattle, but we're, kind of prejudiced against cow people." So maybe that was it. Maybe they thought, okay, this is our livelihood. This is who we are. We are ranchers. We raise livestock. And so maybe we need a God that represents that. I will say that there is an interpretation of what we use for a shofar, right? A shofar, when we make a shofar, it is usually made out of the horn of an it's usually made out of the horn of an animal from the Bovidae family, which includes various, four-legged creatures that give milk, but not cows. That's one of these little rules. Like, you can make it out of a ram's horn. You can make it out of the horn of a kudu, if you've seen those big, long, twisty ones that are sort of straight but twisted, as opposed to like a short, curvy one. The short, curvy ones are for ram's horns. The long ones that have kind of a spiral to them, those are from an animal called a kudu, that is native to the land of Israel, but never a cow horn. Like, not even a Texas Longhorn cow horn. And the interpretation of that is, why no cows? Because we use the shofar in a season of repentance, right? We use it in the month of Elul, preparing for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then we sound the shofar again during Rosh Hashanah and also on Yom Kippur, which is, in some senses, a reminder for us to look inside and see what we have to repair, but it's also calling out to God to come and help us repair. And so the rabbis said, don't use a cow, because when God hears the whole cow thing, or he hears the sound of a cow horn, might be reminded of that whole cow thing that happened in the book of Exodus. And we don't want to remind God of that when we're in the process of asking for forgiveness. So that's my best explanation of the cow thing. I'm sure there are better explanations out there. Let's see. Somebody says, "Excuse my ignorance. I'm trying to learn." Dude, we are all trying to learn. I've got some ignorance myself, but that's why I'm doing this, so that I can learn more in order to teach better, and so that people can learn with me and ask your questions. That's why we're here. So never, I always say to people, never ask any forgiveness for your ignorance, because we are all there in some level. The important thing is that we're here to learn together, and I'm delighted that people are here. Let's see. Elizabeth says, "I think God forgave the sin of the golden calf. If not, Shekhinah would not have come into the Mishkan." I just use a fancy word there, Shekhinah, which is a word for God's presence. When the whole Mishkan was done, it said that a cloud descended and God's presence filled the sanctuary. Hashem always forgives, by the way. I'm with you. And sometimes God gets mad. I'll say. Sometimes, we suffer from things that we do, and some people attribute that to God. God has this, I'm not going to say dual nature, because that's a little bit polytheistic, or bitheistic, I guess. I don't know. But God does have these two aspects of mercy on one hand and judgment on the other. This is another teaching of Parashat Pekudei, is, why was it Bezalel and Oholiab who were chosen for this job? It says Bezalel, when it gives sort of their genealogy, their last names or their backstory, if you will, it takes pains to say that Bezalel is from the tribe of Yehuda. And Yehuda is kind of a mascot, if you will, for tshuva, for mercy. Yehuda is a person in our narrative who makes mistakes and then makes up for those mistakes and then does well for himself afterwards, because he made a mistake, he learned from that mistake, he made amends for that mistake, and he did so well that that's why we're called Jews today, right? There were a lot of tribes we could have been named after, but the Romans called us Judeans or Judeans, because the one aspect of our original commonwealth that remained was Judea, or the territory of the tribe of Yehuda. And Yehuda is the one who, when the brothers are realizing the errors of their ways, and Pharaoh's assistant, who is secretly Joseph, says, "Okay, either I'm going to put your little brother in jail unless your father shows up," and Yehuda says, "No, take me instead." Right? Yehuda is the one who makes up for the whole thing of getting Joseph sold into slavery to begin with. And and that's not all. He has another mistake. There's this episode with his daughter-in-law Tamar, where he has relations with his daughter-in-law when instead he should be providing her with a new husband after his son died. And he's faced with this error. He could have whitewashed the whole thing. He could have had her killed so that nobody knew about it. But instead, he fessed up. He said, "You know what? I did the wrong thing. Please forgive me." And they had a child. And they had multiple children. One of their children was Perez. And Perez is an ancestor of Boaz, who is an ancestor of David, who is traditionally an ancestor of Mashiach. Right? So from a big mistake comes, down the line, Mashiach. If that's not redemption and forgiveness, I don't know what is. So Bezalel is of this tribe. He represents forgiveness and mercy, whereas Oholiab, it says, is of the tribe of Dan, or Dan, depending on your accent. But the rabbis look at that and relate the word Dan to the word din, which means judgment. And so in manifesting God's presence, or making room for God to dwell among us, who are the leaders we pick? Somebody from Yehuda and somebody from Dan. Somebody who represents mercy and somebody who represents justice or judgment. And both of those are important. A world with only mercy, right? There can be no justice, right? If people are not held accountable, then that world can operate. But a world that only has judgment and no mercy is also equally unlivable. And so in creating the Mishkan, it was important for there to be an aspect of mercy and an aspect of judgment as well. Let's see. Milo shares large cult of sun god imaged as a bull sacred animal in Egypt. Great reason for picking a bull, probably very popular. Sickle shares always farmers versus cowboys. Oi, Dr. David Melman here in Amazon Video is quite awesome. I don't know what there's a musical. You know, the farmers and the cowboys should be, or the farmers and the ranchers should be friends. I mean, Oklahoma, I'm guessing. We got Dorothy Sue. Good morning, Rabbi. So glad to see everybody in here. Good Shabbos. We've got, so is the Mishkan like a rainbow, a sign of a covenant? So we have various signs of the covenant in Judaism. We've got a couple of tablets. We've got a couple of more tablets. What's interesting about this Parsha is it talks about building the ark as a place to, maybe it's not in this Parsha, it might be in a different one, but somewhere where it's talking about building the ark, it says you place the broken tablets and the new whole tablets in the ark together, right? It's not just for carrying the brand new, it's not just for carrying the new hotness, it's also for carrying the old and busted, right? Because even our brokenness is something that we carry with us, but not just our brokenness. And so I think there's a profound teaching there. Maybe not teaching it very profoundly, but I think there's a beautiful image in that when we march forward with this connection with God, we carry the broken as well as the whole, which also teaches us that as we march as a community, we should have our broken members present with us as well as our, less broken members. But so we have that sign of the covenant. We have the rainbow as a sign of a different covenant. The tablets are a covenant with this family, with the Jewish family. There's another sign of a covenant with a Jewish family, not even necessarily a Jewish family. Also, let me back that up. There's the covenant with Abraham, that part of which includes circumcision. And here's where the haters come in, because every time I make a video talking about circumcision, that's a very controversial topic in medicine and child rearing today. I'm just speaking about historically. God said, part of our covenant, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my Abraham, and there's a little bit of surgery involved. That's not just for us, because it says he circumcises his son Ishmael as well, who is a progenitor of Islam and other peoples in the world. So multiple peoples use circumcision as a sign of a covenant between humans and God, not just Jews. So I'll say the tablets are ours, like the Jewish covenant. Circumcision is sort of the Abrahamic covenant, right? All the descendants of Abraham have that covenant with God. The rainbow, I'm glad you brought this up, is a covenant between God and all of humanity, right? Not just Jews, not just Abrahamic faiths and monotheists, but everybody. Because the rainbow is a sign that comes after the flood, where God destroyed essentially all of humanity except for one family. But then after that, decided or declared, I'm never going to do that again. And the rainbow is the reminder of that covenant that God would no longer undertake to destroy all of humanity and start over. So we have various levels of covenant. There's covenant with humanity. There's covenant with monotheists or Abrahamic faiths. And then there's the covenant with Jews, just Jews. And that's what the tablets are all about. So Grysicle says, in our denouement, to use my French word again, thank you for that. I used the word accoutrement earlier. I do not speak French, so please correct my pronunciation. Hashem forgives all because you can't take it with you to the spirit world, of course, so I understand. There are various ideas about this. I always say that the two hardest questions to answer, the two hardest metaphysical musings that every religion has to face up to, because these are pressing human questions, is why do bad things happen to good people and vice versa, and what happens after we die? And so to resolve both of these questions rather neatly, many faiths, including some aspects of Judaism, have this idea of an afterlife that balances the scales, right? If good people suffer in this world, they have a greater share in Olam Haba, in the world to come. If bad people prosper in this world, then they have a lesser share in Olam Haba if they ever make it there. Most people do, but just saying, it's not as nice. And this is, I'll say, a Jewish eschatology. This is one idea of Jewish afterlife of many, because we're really more focused on doing mitzvahs in this world and less in what happens. But this is a very satisfying teaching for people who believe that God is just and wants the world to be a just place. Good people suffering seems unjust. And so it's nice to think that there is a heaven that balances that. Likewise, when wicked people prosper, people's sense of justice is attracted to the notion that wicked people pay some price in the afterlife. And so that explains, is the world just when it doesn't seem that way all the time? And also explains the career of the soul, what happens after we die. The problem is we have very few reliable reports from the afterlife. And so this is a little bit off the track, but this is a question I get asked all the time. There's some rabbis who are very satisfied with this notion, and there's some rabbis who are very unsatisfied with this notion. And that's you look at Masechet Brachot 5a and b, I think, where in one teaching there is this notion of an afterlife that balances the scales, and on the next page, rabbis say, "Hey, you're suffering. Would you like to continue suffering so you have a greater share in the world to come?" And they say, "No, thank you. Heal me, please." Right? Because we need our bodies healed in this world to do mitzvot, and that's that we neither want the suffering nor its reward. And so that's an important question. Hope I answered that slightly helpfully. Maybe that's a longer session, I think, sometime that I'd love to share with you. Rabbi, can you say something about the eternal Mishkan and the meaning of this? I guess I'm less familiar with the notion of the eternal Mishkan. And again, I don't know everything. I haven't studied everything. I've heard people talk about the eternal Mishkan before, that this is a thing that follows us. This is, we have the ability to experience God's presence whenever and wherever we are. Is there a Mishkan that exists out there in another realm where God can always be present? Perhaps. Again, I tend to follow this particular instruction from the Talmud that says there are four things that it's better that there are four things that it's better that you had never been. The rabbis teach that there are four things that it's better that you were never born than if you study these four things. Right? There's making a clear value statement like, don't dwell on these four things, you'll just suffer. And it's better that you had never been born than to dwell on these four things. And those four things are what's before, what's after, what's above, and what's below. Right? What was the universe like before there was a universe? And what's the universe like after the end of the universe? Right? What preceded creation? What follows the end? And likewise, what is above and what is below? Like, what is the nature of heaven? Right? Where is it? Who's there? What do they look like? What's the nature of the underworld? Right? There are many early Jewish ideas of an afterlife that's very much like this. So the word Sheol is used. And Sheol is described as a place that sounds very much like the Greek notion of Hades in the underworld. Right? Someplace everybody goes. And it's somewhere underground. And again, we've been talking about important stuff for several thousand years now, so we've had different ideas about it along the way. And no idea is fixed, no idea is permanent. That's my particular take on it. But we have different examples to draw from. And so the rabbis are saying, look, you have a job to do in this world, right? You have mitzvot, you have commandments, you have a family to take care of, God willing. Right? You have responsibilities. And so what you really want to focus on, young man or young woman, or old man or old woman, or everybody in between, age or gender, the primary human occupation, these rabbis are saying, should be, how do I live the best life in this world that I can? Best for, not just joy, but the best for me and the best contribution for other people. And I know live your best life is something that goes around the internet quite a bit. But they had an idea about that. Your job is to live your best life in terms of your holy connections, your relationships with other people, your contribution to society at large. Because if you step out of that and focus on the afterlife or focus on uh, mystical cosmology or worry about heaven or worry about hell, that takes you out of the game. And so we have plenty of mitzvahs to study beyond that. If you are wondering, like, okay, what kind of share am I going to have in the world to come? One of these rabbis might come back and say, well, did you feed a poor person today? And you might say, oh, is that going to give me a bigger share in the world to come? And the rabbi might say, I don't know, but he's still hungry. Right? There are things to focus on in this world that could occupy all of our attention. And so I'm not judging people for having those questions. Everybody has those questions. The bulk, I won't say the bulk, a lot of Kabbalah and mystical Jewish studies are there to answer those questions. But there's a reason that traditionally Jews don't study Kabbalah until after they've mastered Torah and Talmud and all of these, let's say, this world wisdom, and then, establish families and a career and are pretty settled so that they're in the right mature frame of mind for these mystical pursuits. I'm going to take a stand on this. I know there's the Kabbalah Center and there's Kabbalistic teachings that are accessible to people, and those have helped people. Those have legit taught people ways to improve their lives. The bulk of the tradition, especially within the Talmud, says, don't worry about the afterlife. Don't worry about what came before or what's above or what's below. You got a job to do here, son. And that should occupy most of your time. So I hope that doesn't sound dismissive. I know people have these questions. All religions try to resolve these, including ours. But my favorite thing to study and my favorite thing to teach is, what can we learn about this world? Can we improve? Right? Can we learn? Can we grow? Can we connect with people? Can we experience joy in this world with the gifts that God has given us? And I like to think the answer is yes, but there's a lot of instructions on how to do that. So let's go back to the chat. I think we've had a great conversation today. We've gone for a little over an hour now, so I think I'm going to close this out. Listen, everybody, I really appreciate your learning this stuff with me today. I really appreciate people listening to this podcast. I really appreciate people watching this video and chiming in with your questions. If you're watching this later, or if you are listening to the Jew Curious Show podcast, where I've shared some of what my friends have to say and hopefully answered a few questions, know that you can participate. Know that you can participate in this too. You can jump in live. Just check me out on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, type in Rabbi Jon with an H, Carrier with 3 R's, and you will find my channel and see all the live programs that I have coming up, where you can jump in live, learn with me, ask your questions, God willing, get them answered with some satisfactory answer. And by answering those questions, we're also helping to teach people who have the same questions that you do. Because friends, if you have a question, chances are somebody else has that same question. And by asking it, you are helping them as much as you're helping yourself. So really appreciate doing this live format. Just want to give a few more notes before we close the show. When this airs as a podcast, you will be able to find the show notes on this episode at jewcurious.show/28. That's, you will be able to find the show notes to this episode on, so back up. Again, this is the fun part of live recording. This is something that's going to happen in the future. If you want to learn more about this episode, you can find the show notes to this episode of the Jew Curious Show podcast at jewcurious.show/episode 28. That's the word episode, the number 28, where you can get links to various things that we've talked about, some citations of these quotes that we've shared today, and learn how to connect with me, learn how to connect with each other. There's a link on there to something else I want to make sure you're aware of, and that is the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a place on Facebook, sort of a private community that you can get involved with. I have a couple of questions I ask people to make sure they're not spam bots or trolls or something like that. And so you go to this place. You answer a couple of questions, and then you are in a carefully, lovingly curated, troll-free zone. And how you connect with that is go to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. But you don't want to type all that business. Just go to jewcurious.show/JCC and learn how to connect with us. The final favor that I want to ask of you is, if you have enjoyed this show, if you've learned anything at all, I would really appreciate it if you would go to iTunes and give us a review. iTunes uses those reviews to help share this podcast with other people who may benefit from it. So if you've benefited from it, go to iTunes, look for the Jew Curious Show, give us a star rating of your choice. Honest reviews only, please. No shills out there in the crowd. That's my Tom Waits voice. That's my Tom Waits voice coming back. But give us a star rating of your choice, and I would be delighted if you would leave us a brief review letting us know what you think of the show, how it's helped you, if it's helped you, so that other people who could benefit from this learning could find it as well. I really appreciate our doing this learning together, Hero. And until next time, peace.